Wait, Bruce,
So the folks at home are getting more of the floor show than they usually get.
I think we're good though. We're ready.
Okay.
what do you want to say?
Right here.
There?
Alrighty then.
I'm just
To
asking.
those who are at home, welcome to our whirlwind tour through the Gospel of John. We have made it all the way to the 9th chapter.
Okay.
Remember, we ended last week with the remarks of the Savior who said, "Before Abraham was, I am." Remember the significance of that from last week. What a wonderful statement of the deity and eternal nature of Jesus Christ. That we will see even in future declarations in this gospel, that he says that he and the Father are echad. In Hebrew, he and the Father are one. So, let's go to the 9th chapter. Let's just go to the first verse of the 9th chapter. I'll figure out the way to close these notes up.
9th chapter what?
Chapter 9.
John.
John chapter 9. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, teacher, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" What a question. There was no shortage of unfortunate people in Judea. And when they passed by this particular man, I'm not sure exactly how it was they knew he had been born blind. But evidently, enough was known about this man generally, and the disciples themselves had some specific knowledge to the fact that the man had been born blind. Now, their big question was not that, "Lord, are you willing to heal this man?" "Sir, blind man, do you know who's standing right here near you?" The light of the world, the one who came to bring sight to the blind, is standing right here beside you. Were you aware of that? Now, the question on their mind was the question that arises from the assumption that the man is blind because of someone's sin. That the misfortune of life is somehow self-inflicted. And if he did not sin in the womb, but was born blind, was this retribution for this man's future sins? Or was this retribution for the man's parents' sin, and by implication his ancestors? Do you remember in the law of Moses it says that the sins of the fathers is meted out to the third and fourth generation, right? So they're saying, who in this chain to whom in this chain do we ascribe guilt to? It's very easy for us to ascribe guilt to some ancestor. It's relatively easy to ascribe potential guilt to his parents. There are some things, some sins that parents can commit that their child might be born blind. Now, there are lots of reasons for children to be born blind that don't involve the direct sins of their parents or their ancestors. In fact, vast majority of children born blind, it's not because of a specific sin for anyone within 3 or 4 generations there. It's a genetic accident. It's a developmental error. It's all kinds of things that can result in blindness. I mean, as a physician, my first question would be about who bore the guilt of transgression that resulted in this blindness. That would really be way downstream. And there are things like congenital heavy metal toxicities, fetal alcohol syndrome in its most severe form, congenital syphilis. That there are things that one could construe to be the result of sin, perhaps, but from our modern perspective, it just seems like a terrible long shot to see someone who's born blind, and the first thing you think about is, who's guilty of the sin that resulted in this. It's kind of far removed from the modern perspective, but in the ancient Near East here, they are preoccupied with the notion, number one, of trying to make sense out of the misfortunes of life. In this modern age, we tend to be a little fatalistic, and we tend to appeal to physical processes or, the non-spiritual world to explain our misfortune. That's a little bit amusing that we get it wrong about as often as these ancients got it wrong, because we exclude the possibility that our behavior might result in some unfortunate outcome, and we lay it all at the feet of naturalistic processes. Whereas the opposite was probably true here. That when they saw misfortune, when they saw any phenomenon, the first thing was to appeal to the spiritual world. Because frankly, they understood the spiritual world better than they understood the physical world. Now here we're in an unfortunate reversal of that. And in our society, even Christians tend to always think in terms of the natural when they should be appealing to supernatural. Well, this was not their problem. They're appealing to the supernatural here. And this is not something they just applied to this man. It's something they applied broadly in their own lives and in looking at the lives of other people. If you were rich, if you were well fed, if you were warm and dry and clothed and all this, they saw that as evidence of God's blessing. Whereas if you were poor or afflicted, they saw that as the consequences of the sins, perhaps not yours, but of someone. They attributed it to spiritual problems.
Yeah.
And so here it is. This man or his parents, meaning his ancestors, either his immediate parents or their parents or their parents or even their parents, whose sin caused this. And the big question that they're raising here is it possible for one to be born blind as a consequence of their own sin? Now think about that one for a minute. Think about this for a second, because because we're going to get to the reaction of the Pharisees here, and it's not at all what you would expect out of spiritually aware people. So here it is. Here's the question: can this man be born with the consequences of his own sin? It's a pretty safe bet that even before that man was born, that a reasonable observer could say, yeah, one of these days that baby's going to be born. And one of these days that baby, God willing, is going to grow up. And in the process of growing up, it is inescapable that he will at some point commit sin. Is it beyond God to ascribe that guilt and provide punishment beforehand to the sin that he knows is inevitable? Now, what they're not discussing here, which we might want to think about, is what would we infer about the nature of a God who did that?
Was condemned already.
Right? So if the default is not innocence, then what is the default state of mankind?
Condemnation.
Mhm. That's exactly right. And so here, it's a much larger question that Jesus is going to answer for his disciples. Because as we're going to find out, the Pharisees don't care about the lesson that Jesus is teaching these disciples. They couldn't care less. So Jesus answers, it was not that this man sinned, or his parents. Jesus just kind of takes that out very efficiently, doesn't he? He said, oh, this is not about sin. It's not about any kind of personal sin. It's not his man's sin. It's not his parents' sin. This has got to confuse them right off the bat. Well, if it's not a penalty for sin, how does one make sense out of the fact that this man cannot see and never has been able to see, and was rendered blind in the innocence of his infancy, in the innocence of his life in the womb? This man was rendered blind. That makes no sense to us. If we cannot reconcile that with the order of things that we think we know. So Jesus says it's not this man or his parents sinned. He says the reason he is born blind, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. That the works of God might be displayed in this man. It says, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. And as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Now, does he say? He says, we have to work while it's day. And as long as I'm here on earth, it is day, because I am the light of the world. Now, what is he saying about this man? Is this man, is the fact that God is mighty only displayed in this man in his weakness? There's Peter. There are his fellow apostles through whom all kinds of signs and wonders are going to be made manifest. It's the fact that this man is blind, and his blindness is so that the glory of God might be revealed. What does it say about them in their strength? Are they disqualified in their strength? Or is there something specific about this man's weakness through which God gains special glory? Well, we're going to find out about that a little bit as we go on here. It said, having said these things, Jesus spit on the ground, made mud with the saliva, and then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud, and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which Siloam means sent, parenthetically, John writes here. So he went and he washed, and he came back seeing. First of all, let's read, and he came back. And he came back with the ability to see. Now there's another one born blind, And he sees initially, and what does he see? He says, I see men as trees walking. Because I have the equipment to interpret, I have the equipment to detect images made of light on the retinas of my eyes now, but I cannot interpret what it is I'm seeing. Now, that's not a feature of this story, but I bring it up because that is a feature of restoring sight to people that are born blind. From a medical standpoint, it's a very treacherous thing to take someone who has never experienced sight and give them that gift without a large amount of counseling and preparation. And the reason we know about this medically is because there are people that are born with what are called congenital cataracts. So that when they're born, they cannot see anything, and it's just a mechanical problem. It's just a physical problem. You fix the cataracts, you do lens implants, and now everything works just like it's supposed to. Except their brains have not learned to interpret the data that comes from that very specialized sensory organ called the eyes. That involves a high degree of processing and back to optic nerves, optic chiasm, the optic striations and radiations back to the occipital visual cortex, and it's a very complicated array of nerves and that sort of thing, and the impulse have to be interpreted by very specialized regions of the brain, and it's not like projecting a picture onto a screen. You've got a little bit of the picture at many, many places on the cortex that codes for sight in the brain. And so the miracle is far greater than anything mechanical that Jesus could have done. So the chances that the mud and the spit itself, just because it's mud and spit put together, did anything are really very remote. In other words, I think we should read this and assume that the mud and the spit and the mud made from the spit really has some other meaning and some other purpose besides effecting the man's healing. So when Jesus spits on the ground, he makes the mud and he puts it on the man's eyes, what's going on? Not very, like I said, it's not likely at all that the miracle that eventuates here has anything to do with that. Why did Jesus do it? Well, actually some pretty good reasons. Did you know that the Pharisees of Jesus' day and later actually discussed the use of mud on the eyes on the Sabbath? You know that was really a big point to them. Is when you can and you cannot put mud on your eyes, and under what circumstances can you put the mud on your eyes on the Sabbath? Big talk. You know, in the ancient world, there were very few things that you could do to relieve discomfort in the eyes. And think about how many diseases affect the eyes. You know, trachoma was very common in the ancient world. Blindness from trachoma, a chlamydial infection of the eyes, really very common. What do you do if you get pink eye in the ancient world? It's going to be well in a week, but you don't know that. Your eye swells up and starts draining pus and that sort of thing. What do you do? Well, what you do generally, since there are very few therapeutics, what you do generally is do things that make you feel better. Palliative treatment, symptomatic treatment, and wet dirt on the eyes felt good. It was cool. It created a barrier and held the eyelid in place so it wasn't rubbing on an irritated cornea. It was very common for people with eye discomfort to use a poultice made of clay and water or dirt and spit for comfort. Now here's kind of how now this is actually, now lest you think that I'm just making this up, because it just sounds too fantastic to be true. It's actually recorded in the Mishnah, which are the teachings of the rabbis of the first few centuries during and after Jesus. And this is actually placed in the Mishnah 150, almost 200 years after Jesus, where it specifically says, it is prohibited to make mud and put it on the eyes on the Sabbath. It's also prohibited to put wine in the eyes. Somebody figured out, probably a good idea, considering a lot of infectious things in the ancient world, that you take what kind of tolerable disinfectant you have on hand, and that might be the wine, and you put it in the eyes, and it probably helps a number of things. But they're saying you cannot do anything to actually help someone who is suffering by this method on the Sabbath. Now, you think they had Jesus in mind when they actually recorded that? I think they did. Because they remembered that they had this big discussion. Well, here's how the Pharisees come down on that. And it's so perverse that it requires comment from me here in class tonight. It's just too strange. It is too weird not to mention in this context. The Pharisees came down on the rules like this. No, if you're using mud on the Sabbath on the eyes to heal somebody, you are a sinner. Now, if you just want to put mud on your eyes because it feels good on the Sabbath, sure, you can do that. I mean, if you just do it recreationally, after all, it's a day of rest, and you're just doing that to, have to relax and be comfortable on the Sabbath, then fine, you're welcome to do that all you want to. But if you're doing it to heal someone, God doesn't like for you to heal people on the Sabbath. They'd already come to these decisions by the time Jesus did this. This has already been a big rabbinical discussion. They have discussed this openly in the Sanhedrin. And in the Sanhedrin, they have 70 rabbis, which means that they had 150 opinions of what was right. Nobody's laughing at that one. I bombed that one. Got 70 rabbis, you're gonna have 150 opinions.
Our calculators aren't working.
Don't quit my day job, is that what you're saying? Yeah. 100,000 comments out of work, and I'm trying to do this. Anyway, so here it is. I mean, there's this big ongoing controversy about the use of mud on the eyes on the Sabbath. Now, just figure that. I mean, that's how bad things have gotten here. You notice last week, when we talked about the woman caught in adultery week before last, I told you how they had an end around to excuse men who want to stray, since men can have more than one wives, and sort of like the modern Muslim way around it. Well, you just arrange to be married for an hour. That's all you got to do. Men, you can get around that. Just make it a temporary marriage. But you women, you got no end around. They can end around adultery and get snagged up on why you put mud on your eyes on the Sabbath. And of all things, Doing it for your own pleasure is fine. Doing it to relieve the suffering of another human being is sin in their book. Let that sink in a minute. That's how screwed up things have gotten, even by the time of Jesus. Now it just gets more and more screwed up after they reject Jesus. But think about just how perverse that is. And so Jesus is making a point here. He doesn't have to make mud and put it on the man's eyes, does he? Does he? I don't think he has the illusion that he is doing anything except putting the Pharisees in their place. Because he knows they're having this big discussion on the appropriate use of mud on the eyes on the Sabbath. And then he don't have a problem with it unless you're trying to help someone. Because to them, healing was work. So he went and washed, and he came back seeing. Let's talk about. Now maybe I'll wait to the end of this because there's a punchline to this. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "Yeah, it is he. It's him." Others said, "No, but looks like him." He kept saying, the man kept saying, "I am the man. I don't just look like him. That is me. And now I can tell you for sure because I can see him in the mirror now." He said, "I am the man." And so they said to him, "Then how were your eyes opened? How is it you can see? You've been taking our money for however many years, evidently into your adult life here. You've been sitting in that same spot, and we've been passing you every day, sometimes several times a day, and we've been giving you our spare change all this time. How is it you can see?"
Yeah.
He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." So they said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I don't know." So they brought him to the Pharisees, the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see." And how many times am I going to have to go through this? He put mud on my eyes, I washed, and I see. And some of the Pharisees said, "Oh, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." Emphasis of mine for you. Everybody here already expects that out of me. Here, you can taste that at a time. Okay. He's not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others said, "How can a man who's a sinner do such signs?" And there was a division among them. So again they said to the blind man, "What do you say about him since he opened your eyes?" He said, "He's a prophet." What do you say about him since he has opened your eyes? Now here, before we go into some of the rest of the story here. Let me just say this, my grandmother, Thelma Neal, itinerant evangelist in the Church of God. She's a blessed, sainted woman. Very, very bright woman. She always said, David, remember this. The man with the experience is never at the mercy of the man with an argument. In other words, if it's your eyes, if you were born blind and your eyes were opened, what are you going to say? Now, what about the lame man? He wasn't born lame at the pool of Bethesda. He wasn't born lame. The implication, the strong implication was that he did indeed sin to result in his lameness. And when he was healed and when he was able to walk, what did he do? He ratted Jesus out, didn't he? He went and told the Pharisees, oh yeah, that's the guy. You wanted to know who the guy was? This guy, born blind, they said, who is it? He says, don't know. I know his name, but that's a pretty common name. Joshua, in ancient Judea. Pretty common name. They said, well, that narrows it down. You know? It's like, saying, what's his name? Joe. Goes down to a mere, what, 500,000 to 800,000 in Dallas-Fort Worth. Good start there, isn't it? Anyway, it says the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight. Nobody heals a man born blind. We've had a few cases over the centuries, you know, somebody got mud on their eyes and then said they could see better, and that's what they weren't born blind. Mud on the eyes, if somebody's born blind, sure. Until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight. Then they asked him, is this your son, who you say was born blind? And how does he now see? This is an accusatory type of tactic taken against this man's parents, isn't it? Your alleged son, who was allegedly born blind, how is it that he has allegedly been made able to see? His parents answered, we know that this is our son, and we know that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know. Nor do we know who opened his eyes. And you kind of get the impression here, even if they did know, they weren't going to want to say. Nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He's of age. He can speak for himself. And this is parenthetical from John again. He says, and his parents said these things because they feared the Jews. Well, the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Now, being put out of the synagogue was not just, disinvited to church. The synagogue represented their entire societal structure and their means for societal support. Their welfare system was integrated into the synagogue. Anybody who was part of the synagogue and found themselves suffering misfortune could be taken care of by the collective of the synagogue. To be put out of the synagogue is to be outside of the social support safety net. It's far more than just not being invited inside. Therefore, his parents said, he's of age, ask him. So, for the second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. And he answered, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. And with the experience, it's not at the mercy of these men with an argument. And they said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I've told you already, and you wouldn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? And they reviled him, saying, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we don't know where he comes from. Remember we went over that last week? He was born in Bethlehem, according to the prophet Micah, and his ministry was in Galilee, according to the prophet Isaiah. I mean, those who live in darkness have seen a great light. Jesus says, as long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. It says that Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, those forsaken, Gentile-ridden areas we now call the Galilee, that's where this man will walk, and that's where this light will shine, according to the prophet Isaiah. So they're wrong. We do know where he comes from. They just didn't know the significance of it. The man answers, he says, we don't even know where he comes from. And the man answers, why, this is an amazing thing. I read a lot of sarcasm in these words. A lot of sarcasm. Why? That's amazing that you don't know where he comes from. And yet, he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. This man were not from God, could do nothing. They answered him. They answered him, you were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? And they cast him out. Now, this is yet another time that absent of an argument, they go ad hominem. Remember we talked about an ad hominem approach to an argument last week, where if they can't refute your argument, they attack you personally. Well, they couldn't refute this man's argument because, why? He had the experience. He had the documented history. It was unavoidable that he was blind. Now he can see. Not only was he blind and now he can see, he was born blind and now he can see. So Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And having found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he answered, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. He said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. Jesus said, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, 'We see,' your guilt remains." He said, if you considered yourself to be blind, you'd be guiltless. Now, for those who consider themselves blind, no one can fault a blind man for not seeing. Can you imagine walking up to somebody who's born blind and say, "How dare you not see? I'm going to lay the guilt of your not seeing squarely on your own shoulders." Well, that's what the disciples wanted to do very early on with this man. Lay the responsibility for his not being able to see on him or those close to him. And Jesus said, no, you're not getting this yet. It's all the way here to the end, and Jesus tells what that's all about. It's all about spiritual blindness. It's not about the physical blindness. It's about the spiritual blindness. This blind man, whose eyes, for some reason, did not capture and record images made of electromagnetic energy, light, was spiritually very adept. He caught on very quickly. He had something, his world changed in a flash, but his worldview did not. Put it this way, his view of the world changed, but his worldview did not. Now the Pharisees, on the other hand, I'm not going to tell this story, but it occurs to me it might be apropos. The other day, Sonia and I went on a rainy day, and there's nothing better on a rainy day than some cold sushi. I talked her into going to eat sushi on a rainy day, cold rainy day. So we decided not only on this cold rainy day is David going to get to eat cold sushi. Would anybody want that on a cold rainy day?
Yeah.
More like a chili or a soup day, right? And I decided it's going to be sushi. Go to the sushi place. Not only that, I decided we need to sit out on the patio. They got heaters out there. We get the full patio experience, and we won't freeze to death, and the sushi will stay cold. We'll have to put it on ice. And so we're sitting out there, rainy day, on the patio, under the heater. And I was just having a good old time eating sushi, and Sonia was looking at me like, you haven't lost your mind. So, we're sitting out there, and I'm looking down there, and now, out of one of we're on the second floor at the Star Center. Everybody been to the Star Center out there at the Cowboys practice facility in Frisco? There's a sushi place that kind of looks out over the common area out there at the Star Center. So out of one of the establishments comes this fellow. He's got a white cane. He's kind of bumping it around out there, and he goes and he stands by the curb. It's obvious he's blind, and he's exhibiting some very typical blindisms, which are, the rocking behavior and all kinds of things that blind people do that they don't realize they're doing because they've never seen what other people do when they're just standing around. And good rehabilitative services for blind people usually teach them away from that kind of thing. This was a young man. His head was a little smaller than it should have been. something called microcephaly, which indicates a lot of blindnesses that are associated with microcephaly or a small head. And so as a clinician, I'm looking and said, there's a microcephalic guy. He's likely to be mentally impaired. He obviously is visually impaired. He's standing in the rain, in the cold rain, by the curb with a backpack, which he eventually took off and put down on the floor, on the ground beside him. He's standing there in the rain, in the cold rain. A blind fellow standing in the rain. Even though one could probably safely assume he was waiting on someone. We sat there, I've sat there and watched him for about 20 minutes, standing in the rain. So I said, I gotta go see if he needs some help. So Simon, hold my sushi. I'm going down. And I go down to the street level and walk out. I put my hand on his shoulder. At the same time, I said, "Sir, do you need help?" No, I thought he was going to hit me in the face, but throws my arm off, just bam, hits me very aggressively, and is it like, "Don't touch me." I don't need any help. I said, "Well, okay, you don't need any help." "No, I don't need any help." So what makes you think I need help? I said, "Well, at risk of stating the obvious here, you're standing in the rain." And he stopped, like, I mean, you wouldn't think it would take eyeballs to figure that one out. But even though he was blind, even as he was blind, he was also blind to his predicament. Now, it's one thing for someone to have some physical impairment and to be gracious about the help of others, right? Because he's obviously blind. He's obviously standing in the cold rain. And if he's waiting for someone, they're obviously either late or not coming. I don't even know if the guy can find his way back inside or under shelter. I don't know if he's turned around, if he's oriented, or what it is. Here's an occasion of a blind man not taking into consideration that he is blind and thinking that he is in control of his circumstances, but it's obvious to a casual observer that is sighted that he's in a situation. While he may or may not be in danger, he's certainly uncomfortable. It's kind of like these Pharisees. They're blind, but they're perfectly all right with it because they think they are in control. They think that they can see better than anybody. Now, I forget the name of the phenomenon. I'll think of it in a minute. It's got a special name to it. But there's this observation made by the psychologist whose name is attached to the syndrome. I'm thinking of it. But where people who are incompetent at any particular skill, they believe themselves more capable than they really are. I'm going to look that up for me, Sonny. See what that name is. Because it's important to remember, because it's very common for people that are incompetent at any particular skill set, that when asked how well, let's take this. How well do you use a computer? "Oh, I'm great at it. I'm skilled at using a computer." Then when you actually test them, they don't do very well. Their estimation of how well they do at some skill.
I'd be the first to tell you no, because I'm not.
Well, yeah. I mean, but it's amazing how often
I
people
know.
will say, "Yeah, I'm good." "Huh?
Dunning-Kruger?
Yeah, Yeah, Dunning-Kruger. Yeah, Dunning-Kruger syndrome, where people that are not particularly skilled at something will overestimate their abilities at something. You know, like if somebody asks me if I can play golf, so I play golf. I can score a 62 any day of the week, and then I go to the next hole. Like, yeah, I'm good at it. I hit that ball more times than anybody on the course. But the Dunning-Kruger effect. So here is, you know, here, like the poor blind man standing in the rain, these Pharisees saying, we are the spiritual visionaries of Israel. Well, they're the spiritual, that's the Dunning-Kruger effect at work, isn't it? Because they're so spiritually blind that they cannot see God at work in relieving the suffering of this man on the Sabbath day. The legalism is so much more important to them than mercy that it has rendered them spiritually blind. So here they are presuming themselves to be the sighted ones while being spiritually blind, and this blind, literally blind man is the one whose vision goes beyond the natural. Now let's go back to the first one.
Wow.
Don't do it again.
I'm sure, well, I can't do it again. I don't even know what did that. Anyway, for you at home, like that. One more time, I'm going to be too brain damaged to. Well, let's go, we're just about out of time, so let's go back to the first part.
Okay. Don't do
I think I'm onto something.
Yes, don't do that.
It's a tablet. I have to touch it. It will not move unless I touch it.
Well, don't touch it like that.
Well, I wasn't even touching it before. I was just acting like I was going to. Okay, it says, it was not this man that sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. Who was that guy? Was it just the miracle performed on his behalf that would display the works of God in this man? Who was this man? Now, Scripture doesn't tell us. He never appears again in Scripture. We get the idea that he is forever a disciple at the end of the 9th chapter. By the time we get to the end of the 9th chapter, he has now embraced Jesus as the Christ, as the Messiah, the Holy One of Israel, as that Son, that exalted Son of Man, right? So, who is he? Scripture doesn't tell us. However, it doesn't mean we don't know anything about him. I'll go back to my notes here.
Can you unplug it right there, David? Is it got
Um,
enough charge? Have you got enough charge to unplug it? Maybe that's
Sure.
what it's doing.
It didn't help any, did it?
Oh.
Well, we might.
Okay.
That's why the racket give you a headache.
Ooh. Well, can't find it in my notes here. Oh, yeah, Celadonius. Tradition, both in Eastern Orthodoxy and the Roman Church, hold that this man's name is Celadonius. blind man's name is Celadonius. The Celadonius is important because he actually is the first missionary into a certain part of France, of Gaul. And he carries the gospel he establishes the Christian church at Nimes, which is in modern France, in Gaul, province of Rome at that time. It wasn't just that the man's blindness would resolve. The man would take that experience, he would take that power, spiritual power, and that spiritual sight he had gained on this encounter with Jesus, and he would take the message of God's Messiah to France.
Praise God, yeah.
Now, had this just been another miracle recorded in the gospel, would it have lacked power? No, I don't think it was lacked power in the least. But I think the fact that not only did the example of this man in his healing bring faith into the hearts of the disciples and to those who witnessed it, this man's life was changed. So like I said, his view of the world changed, but his worldview remained the same. That the world benefited not so much from this man's regaining his sight as much as it gained from what it is the man saw with his spiritual eyes. The Pharisees, neither their view of the world nor their worldview changed, tragically. But we're going to let folks at home go, and we're going to entertain questions. If you have questions at home, enter them into the comment section of the video.